right, moving to the last half of our session, we have up first Marc Levy, who is the Deputy Director of the Center for International Earth Science Information Network at Columbia University, an organization dedicated to providing information and helping the public, scientists, and decision makers worldwide understand the ever-changing relationship between humans and the environment. He also serves as an adjunct professor in Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. And Mr. Levy specializes in the human dimension of global change and has published over 50 peer-reviewed works on environment security connections, environmental sustainability, emerging infectious diseases, the geography of poverty, and the effectiveness of international environmental institutions. So now, Marc Levy.
So, I study conflict. I don't actually carry it out. I don't have a machine gun or anything. I feel like there's a big buffer zone here in front of me. But I'll try to talk to the back of the room. So the work I'm going to summarize here is collaborative work. Involves a number of partners at other institutions. I'll list them by name at the end, but I want to acknowledge at the beginning that this work involves in-depth scientific collaboration with Charles Boris Marty at City University of New York and Niels Peter Gleditsch at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, among others. We're currently living through a wave of enthusiasm over the possibility that climate change may be related to national security issues. These things go in cycles. We're currently on the upswing. We may be at the peak, or it may be getting even more intense. It started a couple years ago, began to heat up when a bunch of retired U.S. generals issued a report arguing that from their vantage point, climate change seemed to be something that national security decision makers ought to be paying attention to. Then, I don't know, is that my thing that's doing that? I don't have a machine gun, but I have something worse, a BlackBerry. After the midterm elections, the U.S. Congress pressured the National Intelligence Council to carry out an assessment on the security threats to U.S. interests stemming from climate change. Similar things are going on in other countries, Germany, the UK, a number of other places. It's not a fever that's only taken root here, it's worldwide. When President-elect Obama announced the selection of Hillary Clinton as his Secretary of State choice, within the first paragraph of her acceptance speech, or the speech at which she was announced, she mentioned the fact that she intended to focus on climate change because it was a national security threat. And so far, she's lived up to that promise. In her very first foreign trip, she made climate change a major topic of concern in her talks with the Chinese. And then very recently, just 2 months ago, Dennis Blair released his annual threat assessment to the intelligence community, and had an entire section on environmental security. 4 out of the 43 pages, almost 10% of the document was devoted to environmental aspects to national security. It was the last 4 pages of the document, so the environment hasn't completely revolutionized the way the national security establishment looks at these things. But I think it's clear that even before the recent election, there was a sea change underway in how people who were charged with protecting the nation's security thought about the threats to that security, and they were taking climate change and related environmental threats much more seriously. So should we care about this or not? Is it just window dressing? Is it a fad? Is it the trend of the moment that's going to go away as soon as something pushes it out of its favored position. It could be the case. I definitely encourage, a healthy dose of skepticism when you see, powerful people arguing that they have turned green overnight. There may be an ulterior motive behind some of those conversions, and as responsible citizens, we need to evaluate those claims, skeptically. But I wouldn't dismiss them. Just because people stand to benefit from a green conversion doesn't mean the conversion doesn't mean something. And so I want to present some empirical evidence to support the fact that there really is a new understanding about the threats to national security, and that in particular the relationship between water availability, or in particular severe droughts, we can now fairly definitively say constitutes a national security issue. I want to first give a kind of scene setter that kind of explains why this change is happening now. And it has to do with a juxtaposition of two different trends. Although there are horribly tragic exceptions to this generalization, it remains true that the world has gotten better at controlling violent political conflict. This is a graph showing post-World War II battle deaths. You see that this is international and internal wars combined together. And you see some spikes when there's, serious things go wrong. But there's a clear secular trend in a downward direction. And as I said, the exceptions are quite tragic. So I don't want to dismiss that or give the false impression that we have solved this problem. We have not solved it by any means, but we've gotten a lot better at it than we were. So and we've gotten better at it because we've built more effective institutions. We've gotten better at implementing peacekeeping missions. We've got better at doing preventive diplomacy, and we've gotten better at making post-conflict agreements stick. Again, there's exceptions to this, but we're better at it than we used to be, and our understanding of what drives these things is better than it used to be. So for people who want to do even better and get rid of the exceptions to this trend, they have an agenda, and that they have a fairly good plan for what they need to do if they're going to keep driving that trend all the way to zero. When we look at the environmental side of things, there's no good news to point to. The trends are all going the opposite direction. This is just one way to summarize the bad news when it comes to environmental issues. This is the trend in the total number of natural disasters as recorded by the Center for the Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters. And again, you see exceptions, and the trends can go up and down, but there's a general upward trend here. And not only is the number of disasters going up, but the intensity and the human impacts of these disasters in many cases is reaching higher proportions. The climate-related disasters are the ones that are driving most of that increase. On the left, you have droughts. The big bulge in the middle is floods, and the two over is storms. These are graphs that have time going from the early period to the present, and then this is just the total number of disasters along each subtype. So this is accompanied by an across-the-board failing report card on environmental management. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment found that 60% of the ecosystem services, the provision of livelihoods, the provision of security, provision of cultural resources, were being degraded. So in contrast to what's going on the security agenda, on the environmental agenda, the news is mostly bad, and there's no clear action agenda that people can have articulated that will get us out of this mess. We're still trying to sort through all this stuff, with the news getting worse and worse year after year. So in my mind, the way I see the evolution of the security agenda against these two trends is that when we didn't worry about the environment too much, but the security agenda was horrible, then the security agenda itself was fairly conventional, and people worried about things like alliances and deterrences and defending territorial integrity. Then as we got slightly better, say into the 1980s and 90s on the security front, but people were much more worried about the environmental agenda, we saw a kind of docking of these two communities and what I would call a mixed security agenda, where most of the terms of discourse were defined by the security community, but they did so in a way that showed a much greater sensitivity to the environmental threats to security. So the rise of the concern over failed states in the early 90s is, I think, a clear example of this. So the logical conclusion for me, if I were to predict where this discourse is going to end up, is to eventually discard the conventional terms of discourse from the traditional security community and focus on security the way thousands of years ago the original political philosophers defined it, which is protection against threats from whatever source. And so this agenda would focus on threats to livelihoods, resilience against natural disasters, preservation of choice in personal trajectories. If somebody wants to live in a given place, then they are secure if they're able to do so. They're not forced to flee somewhere else because their resources run out or somebody takes their resources from them. So we have not moved to that direction yet. And Dennis Blair does not believe in that vision, but my prediction is that that's where we are headed. So myself, I locate the work I do kind of scientifically in that middle ground, because I want to be relevant to the people who hold power as well as the people who are trying to change it. But my sort of fundamental premises are rooted in the right-hand side of things. So we have this paradox. It's the best of times and the worst of times. Looking through one set of lenses, the world is more peaceful now than it has ever been. Looking through a different set of lenses, it's more dangerous than it's ever been. And that's a complex reality to translate into an action agenda. And it's a complex reality to understand. It's much more nuanced and subtle than the old security agenda, where you had enemies who wanted to launch nuclear missiles at you or wanted to seize your territory from you. In a lot of these things, there aren't necessarily villains that need to be fought. There are complex interactions that need to be managed. And so that's a different kind of challenge, and it's one of the challenges that the security establishment is relatively new at, and the environmental community is a little bit more experienced in. So I want to focus on drought for a few different reasons. One of them is completely uninteresting, but it's a reality. So for the sake of truth in advertising, I'll tell you that a good reason to look at drought is because there are good data available about drought. And if you want to study something, I would argue that you need to base it in facts. And a lot of the hyperbole from 10, 15 years ago, I think, was counterproductive because it wasn't grounded strongly in empirical observations. But in addition to just opportunistically looking, where the light is, or looking where the data are, there's strong substantive and moral reasons to look at drought. It's been determined by the climate scientists that droughts are likely to get more frequent and more intense. In fact, you can already observe a trend of increased frequency of drought, as shown here, which is a trend that's probably driven by climate change. It's not proven with complete certainty, but the climate scientists say that the downward trajectory in rainfall in a number of places is driven through human-induced climate change. And then if you look at the projections down here, you see a number of places where these dark brown blobs are projected to have significantly less rain in the future than they do now. With conflicts like Darfur showing up on our doorstep, with tens of millions of people's lives affected in horrible ways, and very strong plausible connections observable between their plight and the loss of rainfall due to the 30-year drought that is, probably a function of climate change. Again, not with certainty, but a plausible connection. If we see that at the present people's lives are suffering in horrible ways, plausibly because of drought, and we know that droughts are going to get more frequent, and I think we have a moral requirement to look in some depth at the security connections, the security implications of that aspect of climate change. It's been largely at the official intergovernmental level, it's been completely ignored because the complexity of the causal chain is too much for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to cope with. They've got a political battle to fight, and in order to fight that battle, they've made a strategic decision that they only make statements that they can garner virtually 100% consensus on. And that's served a good purpose. It's helped to knock down all the opponents of climate change so that there's just a few self-interested quacks left in the room. But it's had a perverse side effect, which is that some very important things that are not necessarily 100% known with certainty don't get talked about. And for me, this is one example. So we formed this partnership, Voris Marty, hydrologist, Niels Petter Gleditsch, who's a political scientist and a student of Civil War, and our group, which is a group that tries to focus on the relationship between social sciences and natural sciences, and tried to tackle this question. So the first thing we did was put together this very crude but extremely important spatial time series database on internal bore. And you can tell from the the circular boundaries of these things that it's a very, very crude approximation of where civil wars were fought. So it starts in the 70s and it goes through to the early 2000s. The red blobs are the full-blown civil wars where there's at least 1,000 battle deaths in a year. The yellow ones are battle deaths below that. In some cases, the geographic precision of this map is not really much better than the old-fashioned view of the world where every country was either all in war or all in peace. But in a number of places, you can see that the geographic precision really does help you quite a bit. India is a case where in many years, there's somebody doing something nasty to someone else, but it's usually fairly localized. And so if you're trying to do a geographic analysis on the drivers of war, you really are almost hopelessly hamstrung if you're forced to consider the whole geography of India, which is what you had to do beforehand. So this is a very crude but very pivotal step towards understanding the geographical, climatological, hydrological dimensions of civil war. Then we already had a bunch of much higher resolution, socioeconomic and hydrologic data. So this is what we would like, our conflict databases to look like. So we have, the entire world's population onto roughly a 50-kilometer grid. If we could do that for conflict, we would be in much better shape. So we put the climatological data, the conflict data, and then the correlates together. And we tried to control for the level of economic development, because we know that poverty is the most important risk factor for civil war. The more poor you are, the more likely you are to experience a civil war. So we control for that. We also know that there are certain constellations of political institutions that are very dangerous. Very strong democracies very rarely have civil wars. Also very strong autocracies very rarely have civil wars. It's the countries in the middle, like modern-day Iraq, that are most vulnerable to civil wars. where they've got elements of democracy, elements of autocracy, but they're not really one or the other. So we control for that. And then finally, we control for population density, because there are certain places that don't fight because there are no people. And so that's a fairly obvious thing that we have to control for. And then what we let vary as a driver in this analysis is the amount of rainfall. And we're looking at the deviation from normal, because we found no relationship between the level of rainfall. Very dry places, very wet places, places in the middle, they didn't look different from one another in terms of how frequent their outbreak of civil war was. But the deviation from normal did seem to make a big difference. And so if you look at the places that are experiencing some small level of violent conflict, which means that there's somebody mobilizing opposition to the government, running around making trouble, trying to recruit supporters, but they haven't yet bubbled up to the level of a full-scale civil war. The number of deaths is relatively small. Then on average, about 12 to 14% of the time, those places escalate to civil war in the following year. And that's the countries there, or the grid cells that are there. But if you move far down on the rainfall scale compared to normal, then that likelihood almost doubles. So these are the 10% of the geographic areas on the Earth that have the sharpest drop compared to normal in rainfall. And for those areas that are also experiencing a low-level conflict, about 22% of them escalate to civil war in the following year. There's about a 1-year lag. The longer lags didn't matter. Having it be simultaneous didn't work. This surprised me because I had mainly been a skeptic of the original propositions that environmental scarcity was going to be a driver of internal conflict. It seemed to me that most of the stories people told were really about dysfunctional political institutions in a context of extreme poverty, and that when you controlled for those things, the environmental scarcity didn't really seem to add much. So what this told me is that I was wrong, and that in reality, these environmental scarcity drivers do have an independent effect. What was even more surprising that as the rainfall became greater than normal, there seemed to be a pacifying effect. And as you move down towards the wetter side of the spectrum, again compared to normal, the likelihood of escalation to civil war went down. So the question was, is this just a fluke, a statistical artifact that doesn't really mean anything in reality? We're still trying to find the answer to that question, but so far, everywhere we look, we find confirming evidence and not disconfirming evidence. The basic hypothesis that we're operating under is that violent opposition to the regime is led by political entrepreneurs that you can assume to be operating more or less constantly somewhere. In a poor country, there's almost always somebody who's embarking on a career path of trying to obtain power and riches at the point of a gun in opposition to the state. And so the question is, which of those succeed at obtaining enough followers to actually create a civil war, and which ones kind of have to fade into the woodwork because nobody wants to join them? In very poor countries where people are dependent on subsistence and low-value commercial agriculture, rainfall might make the difference in someone's choice as to whether to join up with the rebels or to stay home and grow crops. It's not a deterministic thing, and we're not arguing that everybody is so morally bankrupt that they will just as soon, start shooting people as grow crops. But at the margin, it is going to make a difference. And if your family is starving to death because you can't grow food on the land, and somebody comes around and gives you an offer to join up with them and give you a weapon that you can use to hijack trucks and raid warehouses and so on, at the margin it may make a difference. This is a graph showing the difference in rainfall in the two parts of Nepal dividing the two parts into the one where the civil war that erupted in the early part of this decade broke out, and the part where it didn't. The red graph is the conflict zone, the black part is the non-conflict zone. At present, the conflict zones are more diffuse, and it's more or less interspersed throughout the country. But when it broke out at the beginning, it had a clear geographic division to it. And what you see is that both zones are more or less moving together, and they start to diverge in the 1990s. And the area in which the conflict broke out plunges much below the other one, and it plunges to a level that had never been recorded since the instruments were capturing these measurements. So I'm not trying to argue that this explains the outbreak of the Nepal conflict, but most of the attempts to explain why this conflict broke out when it did point to increasing levels of inequality and geographic disparities in levels of well-being. It seems to me that there may be an ability to point even farther up the causal chain, and so one of the things we're trying to do is to see whether this the emergence of this severe drought in Nepal was part of the reason that inequality levels diverged, because that fact has not yet been explained. You see a similar dynamic that's not driven by rainfall, but that's driven by commodity prices in Colombia. Darlene Duba and her colleague Vargas at Harvard have done a very neat study where they've taken GIS data on frequency of guerrilla attacks, location of coffee plantations, and then correlations with the severe drop in coffee prices that took place in the mid to late 1990s. And so what they found was that in the municipalities in Colombia that were not dependent on coffee cultivation, that price shock had no observable impact on the frequency of guerrilla attacks. But in the areas that were dependent on coffee cultivation, when that price collapsed, you saw a big spike in the guerrilla attacks. And their argument for coffee is the same as what I'm making for rain-fed agriculture, that when the source of your livelihood is pulled away from you, at the margin it becomes more likely that you're going to support the opposition. This is a more impressionistic bit of evidence, but so it's less, I think, solid in what it proves, but I think its suggestion is quite strong, so I just want to show it to you. On the left is the map that the State Department collects on conflict in Africa, where they explicitly try to delineate the precise geographic boundaries of the conflict. So they've given it this slightly too cute name, Conflicts Without Borders, and they track this month after month where the conflicts are. And then on the right is our map of drought frequencies since 1980. And it seems to me that there's a very strong sort of interocular relationship there, that the areas that have experienced droughts most frequently are the areas that at present are most beset by these ongoing conflicts. So, as I said, we haven't proven this definitively, but I think the case is getting stronger and stronger as more and more work is done on this. And other researchers have found similar results. No researcher has found the opposite result. So I think we're moving towards a condition of being able to say fairly definitively that drought makes conflict more likely. So what? Well, a number of people in the prevention and response communities have started trying to take action on this. So CARE is now explicitly trying to think about the areas that they're going to have to work in terms of areas that are driven both by climate change and by political conflict. And this is the map that they're doing for that. Since we did our historical work, we've now tried to look forward, which is much more difficult. So this is Boris Marty's water scarcity map. It's the black areas that have the most extreme water scarcity. And if we we can project those in the future into worlds that have new levels of population, new levels of economic consumption, and new climate systems. And what we see is that that world is much more dangerous. Potentially at odds with the current, fervor over climate change. It's the economic consumption and the population growth that drives most of the increase in scarcity, not the climate change. And then we can overlay a map of which countries are getting worse in terms of water scarcity, with which countries are located in areas that historically have been especially vulnerable to political violence. We don't have a mechanism for projecting in a multi-decade framework political instability. So we're forced to rely on these more crude devices. And so this is looking at countries that are very high in projected future scarcity and located in very dangerous neighborhoods. So you have places like Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and China. Since we did that work for the National Intelligence Council about a year and a half ago, since then we've tried to dig a little bit deeper and say, well, which elements of this increased consumption are driving this the most? So in these next three maps, we're looking only at the areas that are currently in water scarcity, and we're dividing them up in terms of the rate of increase in different types of water demand. So this is industrial water demand. And blue means that the increase is relatively low. So the red hotspots in the water scarce regions are pretty small, but there are some places that you can see that might be cause for alarm. But it's domestic water demand that's growing much faster in the water scarce regions. And agricultural demand is growing even faster. So for industrial behavior seems to be operating the way an economic rationalist would want, that where water is most scarce, the rate of increase is lowest. But for domestic demand and growing crops, it's the other way around. It's where the water is most scarce that rate of increase seems to be the biggest. So we would be projecting, big problems in these areas in terms of both the humanitarian crises as well as the impacts on livelihoods. A lot of these places where the reliance on agricultural water is going up faster than the supply, if the other conditions are not favorable, those are the areas where people are most likely to have to face that choice between, do I feed my family peacefully or through other means? So this is not deterministic. None of the results here can be put into action tomorrow. The number of other causal factors that are going on, the contingencies, are much too important to permit that. Moreover, in some places, the arrow or the direction of causation, can vary 180 degrees. So in northern Kenya, the nomadic cattle raiding dynamics that go on there are actually influenced in the opposite direction. It's when the rainfall is heavier that you get more violence. So we need to work with more experiments and understand these very specific place-dependent contingencies. So I think that what's happening is the scientific community is rising to this challenge, trying to understand what impact climate change, water scarcity, land degradation, and so on are having on national security interests. We've not yet figured out the answer. This will be, I draw the analogy to what the human rights community was doing 50 years ago, which took several decades to really bear fruit, or the people who were realizing 100 years ago that economic instability might be politically destabilizing. It took them a long time to get their ideas implemented. I think that's more or less where we are now. So we have a lot of community building to do. We can't predict where we're going to end up. But I think just as when the people signed the UN Charter in 1945, they knew they were doing something significant, I think that we do realize that the world is different now, even if we can't predict exactly where it's going to go. So I just want to end by thanking my financial sponsors as well as my intellectual collaborators. And for the undergraduates in the room, the person at the right who's now a doctoral student in Sweden. She began the work on this project as an undergraduate. Is a co-author on the paper and did it as a summer internship. So I encourage you to seize opportunities for summer internships. Thanks.